Thank you, Debbie. I have a group of wonderful friends for many years here. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Alicia. Thank you, all of you who are here. I would like to start with a couple of preambles, if that's okay, because I've been impressed by some of the things I heard today. Amy Gravino mentioned something that is in my mind all the time, that autism is not a disease. Autism is a genetic trait. But what happens for the rest of a child's life is not written when the child is born. And much can be done in order to optimize outcomes in the first years of life. So that's one. And the second one is that I've been coming to this room for several years, and sometimes we said in 5 and 10 years, I would like to add a little bit of urgency to this conversation. I do believe we have a crisis because we have limited access to some services that could potentially benefit the community at large. I was asked to talk about our journey in bringing a tool, a diagnostic and assessment tool to the community. That journey has been, see if I can manage to change the slide. That journey was taken with Warren Jones for the past 20 years or so. Together we leveraged science, we created a tool, we co-founded a company called EarliTec Diagnostics for the purpose of disseminating this tool and returning revenue to treatment, and that activity is monitored by the Dean's Office at Emory University School of Medicine. But my journey really goes beyond that. I've been in this field for close to 35 years. And I had the privilege of training generations of diagnosticians on the gold standard models for diagnosis and evaluation of children, first at Yale and since 2011 at the Marcus Autism Center. And the reason I went from one to the other is the realization that this gold model was actually not accessible to the vast majority of the community that wished to serve. The needs are vast. We know that about 100,000 children are born every year in this country who will have autism. We also know from years and years of science that were we to be able to provide them with early intervention services and supports, that we could potentially optimize the outcomes of these children for many, many, many children for the rest of their lives. And yet, only 1 in 5 children is diagnosed before the age of 5. The median age is still very late, typically school years when children's symptoms have aggravated, the treatments are more expensive, and treatments and outcomes are poor. And one of the main reasons is because there's just not many expert clinicians in this country, and so families cannot access it. And the families are the victims, because they are aware that with no diagnosis, there is no access to treatment. They also have heard the message that we have all conveyed, that earlier is better, but that kind of rings hollow when you don't have access to that service. And that has been named the Diagnostic Odyssey. Well, just one example from the state of Georgia. We worked very closely with the Department of Public Health. And now, Medicaid will not pay for well-child visits at the age of 18 and 24 months if the pediatrician does not screen for autism. So what do we have? That's absolutely wonderful. But the Department of Public Health currently have 4,500 toddlers who have been screened positive for autism, but they'll be able to give access to diagnosis to less than 6%. So thousands of families go home every day. My child was screened positive for autism, but my child will not have access to treatment that could change the child's life. Is this acceptable? Is this ethical? And is it equitable? Because I can promise you that minority children, low-income families, and rural families have even less access. In fact, in this country, if you're a black child with autism, your risk of having intellectual disability is double that of a white child with autism, and this is not genetics. This is lack of access to services. Well, this is not new because we have disparities in the whole of medicine. In fact, the national academies have taken diagnosis as a major area of discussion, and they've reached the conclusion that improving the diagnostic process is not only possible, but it represents a moral, a professional, and a public health imperative. So we're not alone. Another thing that we've learned is that our gold standard, the one that I sort of been espousing for so long, 35 years, sometimes is not so gold, sometimes it's silverish. And in a multi-site clinical trial, we found out that expert clinicians working in expert centers, they assigned to 30% of the cases that they saw suboptimal confidence. And you know what the problem is? When somebody like me, a clinician, feels a lack of confidence in the diagnosis, we tend to wait and see. Which basically, we wait until the child shows obvious signs of autism, by which time years have elapsed and our children have not received those services. So, not so good. So, yes, we need biomarkers in our field because we need to generate access. And our goal has been to enable high-quality early diagnosis via objective, standardized, highly quantitative, cost-effective technology, leveraging the science that we have been practicing, which is developmental social neuroscience, the studies of early brain development. That's what we've been trying to do. But what's the state of biomarkers nowadays? So this is a very comprehensive and influential recent review of biomarkers in the field, and you see that conclusion was not very positive. And we ask ourselves, why? Why are we so delayed relative to other aspects of medicine? Well, one of the reasons that we as a community, we haven't really adhered to the Bible of clinical trials, to the Bible of how to report on diagnostic studies, and those criteria have been there for quite a bit of time. And it's called the Standards for Reporting of Diagnostic Accuracy Studies. And those criteria were created in order to minimize biases and things of that nature so that we can believe in the things that we read. Now, more recently, there has been an upsurge of studies using machine learning and deep learning, diagnostic studies, including in autism. So we need to remember, however, that math is a very powerful tool. With enough data and computational power, you can come up with patterns for a lot of things, but you can also overfit your models. Which basically means, this is just a little piece of advice, that unless that same publication that you are reading has a replication in an independent cohort, that paper probably is not worth a second reading. So think about those things. So what is what we have been working on? We have been using eye tracking technology to measure something called social visual engagement, which is the way that children look at and learn about their social environment. So they do what I do as a clinician, observe children, except that machine does it at 120 times per second, okay? So what is it that I'm talking about? You see that crosshair? That crosshair tells you exactly where a 2-year-old is looking at moment by moment as the 2-year-old is watching those toddlers interacting. But how you quantify those things? So we created this thing called an attentional funnel. These are space-time distributions that allow us to give us a sense of, say, in this case, 52-year-olds, typically developing 2-year-olds, watching a very complex social scene, moment by moment. So why we're doing this? Because when typically developing children, they are watching this very complex videos, they spend 80% of the time looking at the same place at the same time. And what you see there are what we call hotspots of socialization. These are opportunities for social learning, and those things unfold very quickly as they are exposed to that kind of social experience. Now, this is an attentional funnel for typically developing 2-year-olds as they are watching that frame of video. Okay, these are scan paths for 2-year-olds with autism. This is what the typically developing children we're looking at, and this is where the children with autism we're looking at, watching the same thing, but their experience obviously very, very, very different. And those kinds of divergences, they are happening literally hundreds and hundreds of times within minutes, in fact, thousands of times within 12 minutes of video watching. So we could quantify socialization in this manner. Okay? And here you see examples, like this is a frame of the video. That child is pointing, And this is what typically developing toddlers are looking at. This is what a child with autism is looking at. And facial expression, very important socialization. We need to pay attention to that. This is what the typically developing children are looking at, and this is what a child with autism is looking at. And those things happen hundreds and hundreds and thousands of times. So what was the science behind this that we tried to develop? The first one is that this phenomenon, social visual engagement, we found out that is actually under very, very strict genetic control with a heritability estimate of over 90%. Important, remember, autism is a strongly genetic condition. It also reflects early emerging divergences in our children's socialization from the first months of life. In fact, data from 2 to 6 months of life are highly predictive of diagnosis and level of disability at the age of 2 and 3. And nothing shapes the brain of primates more strongly than the fact that we all live together and we require caregiving. And so the same processes that we see in human infants, we also see in other species. But that was the basis for us to move forward because it's important for a biomarker to also have mechanistic value. But how could we leverage this for the purpose of creating a tool? Well, the first thing that you do is that you take your lab, which is the size of a room, and you try to turn it into something that a little more manageable, like this half a fridge of a standalone eye tracking device. We built a facility in order to create this prototype. That's the first thing that we did. The second thing, we had to contact the FDA. And even though we got clearance for this tool in 2022 for the first time, we started our conversations with that back in 2014. It took us 8 years. At the moment that you talk to the FDA, your lab is open to inspections and audits. We had to go through hundreds and hundreds of thousands of line of code that were artisanally created by Warren Jones and make them into industry standards. We had things such as chains of custody. Now everything is controlled. It's like a military operation. And we had to basically conduct repeatability and reproducibility studies for every time that we made a transition. Fun, clinical trials. So what we're trying to test here, we're trying to take a 12-minute procedure and match against gold standard evaluations that take 4 to 10 hours at times by expert clinicians that we don't have. Cheryl Klin was the clinical director for our trials. And yes, we designed the trials and reported our data according to START. So what did we try to do? Step one, we wanted to use our measures in order to match gold standard evaluation given by expert clinicians and expert centers, mining thousands of statistically significant moment-by-moment divergences, as I showed to you. But we didn't want to stop that. We also wanted to be able to proxy a level of a child's social disability and level of verbal and nonverbal ability because this is critical information for treatment. Autism is a big spectrum, and in order for us to personalize treatment, even for toddlers, we need to be able to place the child on the spectrum, not only of disability, but ability as well. We need to build on that in order to match treatments to our children. And then we conducted the studies. These were 3 studies: discovery, replication, pivotal trials. Over 1,600 toddlers, 7 specialized centers, 1 community health center, 2 real-world replications, 3 independent cohorts, and 1 R&R study. Carl Sagan, I think, said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Well, we reported all of the data for these trials in 2 simultaneous publications, one at JAMA and one at JAMA Network Open, with the opportunity of basically providing all of the data and all of the analysis that were done simultaneously. The results were great. They report that objective eye tracking-based measures of social visual engagement can effectively proxy expert clinician diagnosis and comprehensive evaluation of symptom severity for this age group between 16 and 30 months that we prioritize because we need to resolve this issue of lack of access to early intervention. There is a federal mandate out there. Only 1 in 5 of our kids is benefiting from it, okay? And then we took that half a fridge and we miniaturized it into a tablet that works anywhere there is internet connectivity. And we got clearance for that tablet as well back in July of 2023. And the first kids were seen clinically now in August of last year. So this is what the device looks like. And what the process is a 12-minute procedure. And 15 minutes later, there is a clinical report that is issued to a secure clinician portal with a diagnosis, a quantitative diagnosis, with positive predictive value and negative predictive value for the specific child, as well as a quantitative social disability and verbal and nonverbal indices proxying the ADAS and the Mullen. What does, Warren and I don't know anything about companies. I'm a clinician, we're both scientists, so we had to start a company because that company, without it, we are not going to be able to bring this to the community. And Tom Rassaman is the CEO, and Srini Narayanan is the Chief Technology Officer, both of whom with over 30 years in medtech companies, both of whom parents of adults with autism. And this is what the product looks like.
For children with autism, the earlier the diagnosis, the better the long-term outcome. Unfortunately, fewer than 20% of children with autism are currently identified before the age of 3. That delay in diagnosis leads directly to delayed intervention and delayed treatment. However, with the EarliPoint evaluation, we can test children between the ages of 16 and 30 months, assessing their progress on the core dimensions of autism over time. Typically, developing children viewing videos tend to focus on the same area of a scene at the same moment about 80% of the time. The looking behavior of children with ASD tends to differ, such as focusing on objects rather than faces, with important learning opportunities being missed in every social interaction. Using interpretable AI, EarliPoint assesses individual looking behavior at a rate that is imperceptible to the human eye, measuring hundreds of focal preferences per second and then comparing those data to significant attentional moments for typically developing peers. This attentional funnel provides the clinically validated reference standard that gives parents, caregivers, and providers timely, objective, and accurate information concerning potential developmental vulnerabilities, allowing for earlier identification and treatment for ASD.
For academics, the publication is the end of the road. If you're interested in actually changing community, that's just the beginning of the road. And so in terms of implementation of basically promoting community uptake, fascinating. Community-based agencies have been very enthusiastic. We're working with Easter Seals actually in several states already. And departments of public health will have the burden that I mentioned before. Large treatment providers are very excited about too, because their financial model depends on having a child diagnosed. Remember, no diagnosis, no treatment. And even integrated healthcare systems that we're working with, they are very interested in promoting greater efficiency, cost efficiency, as well as access. Research networks are just starting, and I am so in debt with the Autism Science Foundation, because the Autism Science Foundation is launching the very first research network that is using EarliPoint, but we hope there's going to be more. The academic centers of excellence, not so much. And being the director of one academic health center of excellence for most of my life, I only had 2 adult jobs. One, I directed the autism program at Yale, and I now direct the Marcus Autism Center at Children's Healthcare of Atlanta and Emory. It doesn't reflect so well on us, guys, because we need to strive not to become bubbles of irrelevance. I'm afraid that if we don't respond to the needs of the community at large, and I'm really talking about the vast needs of our community, then we will be relegated to a role that is not really very consequential. I believe that the families need and deserve no less. So that was the first indication for this tool for diagnosis and assessment of that condition, but there are others that we're working right now. So we have several clinical trials underway. One of them is as a population-based screener at the age of 9 months and at the age of 18 and 24 months. Unfortunately, our current screeners in this country tend to miss more children than they identify. We talk about children who screen positive, but there are many who are screen negative, because false negatives can go all the way up to 61%. So we need to make sure that we have better tools to do that. We're also extending the age of this tool all the way to 7 years, because the vast majority of kids are still diagnosed later. We are testing this as a quantitative biomarker for treatment response because it's highly quantitative, and so many of our children, they go on receiving treatment for long periods of time without ever being monitored. So we don't know even if the treatment is helping them. That's one. But we are also very interested in providing quantitative information about pivotal skills that the therapist should prioritize in treatment sessions to optimize their children's outcomes. And of course, we're very interested in helping research networks with the potential for quantitative, objective, standardized deep phenotyping. The reason we are doing this is because we would love to be relevant to the communities that we are supposed to serve. We have now studied babies for the past 16 years or so, and we've seen the promise of early intervention. We follow them month by month. And were we to be able to identify them early, diagnose them early, and give them access to these early intervention services, for many children out there, I am pretty sure that we can change the narrative of this condition from one of disability to one of possibility and promise.